Welcome back to Epistemology and the Search for Truth. We're on lesson number 6. This one is critical thinking is critical. So I mentioned 2 weeks ago about the importance of critical thinking. We need to understand the method of inquiry and evaluating an argument or even a fact. Where does the fact come from? Is it only a partial fact? What is the context of the fact? Who is presenting the fact and what is their agenda? Critical thinking is necessary in our pursuit for any kind of truth. Now, the problem is that critical thinking is the Cheshire Cat of educational curricula. It is hinted at in all the disciplines, but appears fully formed in none. As soon as you push to see it in focus, it slips away. If you ask curriculum designers exactly how critical thinking skills are developed, the answers are often vague and unhelpful for those wanting to teach more about it. This is partly because of a lack of clarity about the term itself, and because there are some who believe that critical thinking cannot be taught in isolation, that it can only be developed in a discipline context. After all, you have to think critically about something. So how do we learn critical thinking? What goes into it? How do we improve our critical thinking skills? There is no single answer to that, but let me suggest a structure with 4 key areas. First, we have to learn argumentation. Also, number 2, you got to learn logic. 3, we need to learn psychology. And 4, the nature of science. So these 4 areas are bound together by a common language of thinking and a set of critical thinking values. So first, let's talk about argumentation. The most powerful framework for learning to think well in a manner that is transferable across contexts is argumentation, or what we may think of as debate or rhetoric. How do we formulate an argument, and how do we evaluate the merits of an argument? Arguing, as opposed to simply disagreeing, is the process of intellectual engagement with an issue and an opponent with the intention of developing a position justified by rational analysis and inference. Arguments have premises, those things that we take to be true for the purposes of the argument, and conclusions or endpoints that are arrived at by inferring from the premises. So understanding the structure allows us to analyze the strengths of an argument by assessing the likelihood that the premises are true, or by examining how the conclusions follows from them. So arguments in which conclusion follows logically from the premises are said to be valid. Valid arguments with true premises are called sound. The definitions of invalid and unsound follow. So this gives us a language with which to frame our position and the basic structure of why it seems justified. So I would love every high school to have a class on rhetoric or debate, or to see the debate team as popular as the basketball or football team. Our world would be better for it because we know how to better dialogue and disagree, but also better understand when someone's argument is faulty. We'll talk more about rhetorical and logical fallacies that are commonly used in poorly formulated arguments over the next few weeks from now. But so often, people present these arguments and they're full of logical fallacies. They're not sound at all, but we buy into them because we aren't following the critical thinking processes. We don't understand always argumentation and how an argument should be formed. And we don't know how to sometimes give our own argument, so we just get mad, or we think shouting sometimes will get our argument across better. It rarely works. So second is logic. Logic is fundamental to rationality. It is difficult to see how you could value critical thinking without also embracing logic. People generally speak of formal logic, basically the logic of deduction, and informal logic, also called induction. The main difference between inductive and deductive reasoning is that inductive reasoning aims at developing a theory, while deductive reasoning aims at testing an existing theory. So inductive reasoning moves from specific observations to broad generalizations, and deductive reasoning the other way around. One of the most influential works on preaching that certainly influenced me is a book that challenged the way preaching had always been done using a deductive method of argumentation. Basically, all those old sermons were, here's the basic premise we all understand. Now I'm going to give you 3 points that defend what we already all understand is the point of the sermon in the first place. So the author of this book, Fred Craddock, advocated for an inductive method of preaching, which is how I typically preach, where we kind of start with some ideas and form some theories about what this might mean for us together. A deductive sermon would be the old thesis statement at the beginning of the sermon, followed by 3 points to provide evidence that the thesis at the beginning is true. The book is called As One Without Authority and completely changed the way sermons were written and delivered. Deduction is most of what goes on in mathematics or Sudoku puzzles, and induction is usually about generalizing or analogizing, and it's integral to the process of science. Using logic in a flawed way leads to committing of the fallacies of reasoning, which famously contains such logical errors as circular reasoning, the false cause fallacy, or appeal to popular opinion. We'll talk more about that next week. Learning about this cognitive landscape is essential to the development of effective thinking. We should all take a logic course. Next up is psychology. The messy business of our psychology, how our minds actually work, not how we think they work, is another necessary component of a solid critical thinking course. Pete Stillman teaches psychology at the high school level, and I'm sure he will attest to its importance in helping mold and create critical thinkers. One of the great insights of psychology over the past few decades is the realization that thinking is not so much something we do as something that happens to us. We are not as in control of our decision making as we think we are. We are masses of cognitive biases as much as we are rational beings. This does not mean we are flawed, it just means we don't think in the nice linear way that educators often like to think that we do. It is a mistake to think of our minds as just running decision-making algorithms. We are much more complicated and idiosyncratic than this. So how we arrive at conclusions, form beliefs, and process information is very organic and idiosyncratic. We are not just clinical, truth-seeking reasoning machines. Our thinking is also about our prior beliefs, our values, our biases, and our desires. I did a series on this 2 years ago where we talked in more detail about how our minds actually work and what affects our decision-making, things like cognitive biases and heuristics. You can find those courses on our website or reach out to me if you would like my written notes. So fourth is the nature of science. It is useful to equip students with some understanding of the general tools of evaluating information that have become ubiquitous in our society. Two that come to mind are the nature of science and statistics. Learning about what the differences are between hypotheses, theories, and laws, for example, can help people understand why science has credibility without having to teach them what a molecule is or about Newton's laws of motion. Understanding some basic statistics also goes a long way to making students feel more empowered to tackle difficult and complex issues. Statistics is important because it helps us realize how numbers can be used and manipulated. Numbers don't lie, but people use numbers to lie or misinform or massage opinion. Personally, I think high school should focus on getting students to take statistics instead of calculus. I haven't used calculus since my class in 11th grade, but my knowledge of statistics comes into play almost every single day. It's not about mastering the content, but understanding the process. So embedded within all of this is the language of our thinking. The cognitive skills such as inferring, analyzing, evaluating, justifying, categorizing, and decoding are all the things that we do with knowledge. If we can teach using these terms with a full understanding of what they mean and how they are used, then teaching thinking becomes like teaching a physical process, such as a sport in which each element can be identified, polished, refined, and optimized. In much the same way that a pitching or quarterback coach can freeze a video and talk to an athlete about their foot positioning or the center of balance, their arm rotation, a teacher of critical thinking can use the language of cognition to interrogate a student's thinking in high resolution. All of these potential aspects of a critical thinking course, so to speak, can be taught outside any discipline context. And I'd love to see more high school, college, even adult education offerings that cover some of these subjects. General concepts of argumentation and logic are readily transferable between contexts once people are taught to recognize the deeper structures inherent in these fields and apply them across a variety of situations. So it's worth understanding, too, that a good critical thinking education is also an education in values. Now, not all values are ethical in nature. In thinking well, we value precision, coherence, simplicity of expression, logical structure, clarity, perseverance, honesty, and representation, any number of like qualities. We so often talk about teaching values to young people, but if we are to teach values, why not teach the values of effective thinking? So let's not assume that we'll learn to think critically just by learning the methodology of various subjects. Sure, it'll help, but it's not an explicit treatment of thinking and is therefore less transferable. Now, there are plenty of books, online courses, and more than anyone of any age can begin to engage with these areas of study: argumentation, logic, psychology, and scientific method. So if you want to learn more, please reach out. I'd love to share some works with you.